The MANHWA begins in the grand church. The speculative voices of the people present ripple through the air as they comment on the wedding to take place, calling it the most absurd wedding they've ever seen. Another voice even dared to add that he thinks the Empress Dowager has gone too far. A group of ladies settle in a corner, whispering amongst themselves that it appears like the Grand Duke Richard's bloodline will end there. They continue, gossiping about how they'd heard that the daughter of the Hartborn family is under a curse. Even if the Grand Duke is a warmonger, I never imagined the Empress Dowager would go so far as to marry off her stepson to a daughter of Count Hartborn. There is a reason people can't stop whispering about that marriage. The daughters of the Hartborn family are said to die before they reach 20, the curse of House Hartborn, that is the rumor they whisper about in fear. Through the endless gossip, a man's voice echoes as he softly comforts his wife, asking if they should stop the wedding now before it's too late, suggesting she was bound to be mistreated for being too weak to bear children. However, a girl's urgent voice cuts in. She confronts her parents, asking if they were really planning to call off the wedding just when it is about to start, but her father cuts her off with a firm reminder. She was the only one of their 3 daughters who survived after all. She goes silent, the sudden reminder echoing in her mind. It was true, she was the surviving child, at least for now. Her 2 older sisters had passed away at a young age, and just like them, she was weak ever since she was young too. No matter how much she wished to play outside, she could never step out. Her mom, sorry for her, would pull her into a warm embrace with tears in her eyes, reminding her she wasn't healthy enough to do that and she didn't wish to lose her just like she lost her 2 older sisters. So, please Frida, just stay home. She was prepared to live a short life, and she was basically kept confined because her parents were so overprotective. However, an opportunity has presented itself. If she gets married, all of that changes. She gently comforts her parents, telling them it is normal to get married and not to get too worried. She flashes her parents a gentle smile to set their minds at ease, all the while thinking of how the Empress Dowager had arranged that marriage for political purposes, so it didn't matter if they were against it. And on the other hand, she could say goodbye to the days of simply waiting to die. The scene shifts quickly to both parties standing at the altar. Standing beside such an upright man, she can't help but steal a glance, and then she realizes it's the first time she's met him, and contrary to her thought, he looked more gentlemanly. It all left one question lingering in her mind: could such a man like this really be the Emperor's hound? Suddenly, the door bursts open. The man standing calls out to the Duke and informs him that the son of the escaped traitor, Arthur Nottingham, had been found. He insists they must go after him immediately. The priest snaps and asks what he thought he was doing during the sacred ceremony. He orders him to leave at once, saying no matter how much the Grand Duke loves war, he wasn't a barbarian who would just run out in the middle of his wedding. However, a smirk slowly appears on the Grand Duke's lips as he mutters a careless apology. He turns back and remarks that it seems he's a barbarian, then he orders for them to stop the formalities there. And just like that, on her wedding day at 17, her mother wouldn't stop crying and her husband left her behind. But strangely, she wasn't happy or sad. All that mattered was that she was married now and she could finally go out into the world beyond the mansion. Even though, her husband fell into a coma immediately afterwards. 3 years later, at Munheim Castle in the southern Svergian Empire, particularly Utrecht, Duke Richard's territory, a knight urges a lady to return inside. Muriel Roswald, Frida's guard, points out how she's been in the sun for so long, but Frida simply assured her it's fine, since she's wearing a hat. Finally, she shoves a basket of freshly picked flowers in front of her and asks if she thinks the Grand Duke will like it. Muriel immediately falls silent, hand-reeling with thoughts of how he was known by so many terrifying names like the Emperor's Hound and the Silent Killer, but still, she cared so much about him. She presses her teeth together, her voice trembling with annoyance as she asks if she really likes him that much. She brings up how he'd not only cut her wedding short, but he'd also been unconscious for 3 years now. She assures her she can return to her family whenever she wants, insisting that her father would want that too. She asks her to just say the word, but Frida cuts her off with a gentle thank you for her concern. The next minute, her face brightens and a laugh escapes her lips as she assures Muriel she's really fine, and she's satisfied with the freedom she has now. Later, she returns to the Duke's room holding her basket of flowers. She settles gently beside him, her husband, Daniel Johannes Richards, whom they hadn't exchanged a single word with each other since their wedding day. She worried that he might never wake up, but it wasn't hard to take care of him. After all, he was the one who gave her the chance to enjoy that freedom, so she wanted to help him as much as she could. She places her hand on his, a smile tugging at the edge of her lips as she gently assures him, for as long as she's alive, she'll fulfill her duties as his wife. However, the next minute the atmosphere shifts. She slaps herself to get rid of the distraction, reminding herself that wasn't the time for all that. After all, she had so much work to do that day. First she'll arrange the flowers she'd picked in the vase, but she suddenly catches something from the corner of her eyes, a light twitch. She turns to him still dazed, however before she can process it any further, his firm hand suddenly grabs hers, sending the basket of flowers in the air. She ended up on his lap pondering on the whole situation. My husband, who had been unconscious for the past 3 years, had suddenly woken up. Although nervous, she forces herself to speak, and asks if he's awake and if he recognizes her. However, he simply stares back at her. After a short while his eyes widen with realization and he blurts out, "Flowers." A shocked gasp escapes her lips, her cheeks turning a different pigment as she asks if he's saying she's like a flower. However, he quickly clarifies that that isn't what he meant. Then he directs her attention to the scattered flowers on the floor and asks, "What's with all the tacky flowers?" Later, some of the Duke's men come to report to him. Dominic Muller, the Duke's right-hand man and close friend, speaks first, offering to introduce her to him. He informs him she is the Grand Duchess and his wife, whom he married 3 years ago. The Duke, clueless, asks if his wife is that woman, and they immediately hurry to scold him. They ask if he's aware how much she's suffered that whole time for him to refer to her as that woman. Sensing the situation, she steps in and pleads for them to calm down, suggesting he might be very confused. After all, he'd hit his head and woke up after 3 years. Mole's father scolds him further, calling it strange how it took him 3 years to wake up from simply fitting his head on a mere rock, while Morel gently nudges him, insisting he can't speak like that. After all, that only happened because the Duke was trying to save him. Dominic also teases him, remarking that since he's been lying there for years, he's sure he's learned his lesson and wouldn't recklessly try to save someone's life anymore. Both father and son smile in satisfaction until the Duke's voice cuts through, "You too." He furrows his brows, his gaze piercing as he delivers a harsh warning to them not to overdo it. On the other hand, Frida's eyes widened as if she just realized something. Glancing at the Duke, she notices his eye color has changed to red and finally realizes it's true that his eyes turn red when he's angry. Dominic's father, the mercenary captain, suddenly speaks. He brings up how he has a wife now and asks if he shouldn't be careful with what he says, revealing that he was worried that her Grace might become upset. In response, the Duke shoots him a glare, his tone growing hoarse as he demands to know what the hell he was on about. However, he suddenly flinches the minute his gaze catches Frida standing to the side. Facing her doll-like expression, he feels a sharp stink that cracks his demeanor for a second before he asks if she can step out for a moment. Once she gets out, he orders Dominic to give him a short summary on everything that had happened in the territory over the past 3 years. Dominic, without hesitation, flashes a smile and reveals the Duchess had sold everything of value in the castle and grew a herb garden. Frustrated, he asks him to cancel that and explain in detail. Then, he asks if he still remembered how the Utrecht territory was notoriously barren, and to the west they had the Atlas Mountains and to the south the Raffles Mountains, so there was no suitable land for farming. But suddenly, the Grand Duchess looked around the territory and suggested they cut down the forest east of the castle. He admits that at first he didn't understand what she meant, but she'd said that to develop the territory, they needed to secure land for their citizens to settle on. In the end, they had workers clear the Atlas Mountain range, and to pay them they sold everything they could. In response, the Grand Duke furiously asks if that is why his room has now become a flower garden, but Dominic simply tells him that is what the Duchess likes. Dominika Dad also chimes in. He reveals that there are 5 times the number of subjects now compared to when he first owned it, and now they've also began collecting taxes little by little. In addition to that, he also mentions that last year they'd cultivated land near the castle and planted herbs, and although they were seemingly just plants, they surprisingly fetched a high price. The Grand Duke, however, merely runs his head in confusion, admitting he doesn't get it. He asks if such a little woman had done all that by herself, and the marshal confirms it. He flashes him a smile, adding that even though she's only half his size, she is full of immense courage. Later that evening, Frida returns to the Grand Duke's room. She explains that she thought he might be hungry and informs him that the doctor had said that the soup would be okay, asking if she should bring some. As she speaks, she realizes the window's still open and hurries to close it. Also, for warmth, she informs him she'll be lighting the fireplace too. Once she's done with that, she tells him she'll wipe him down first since he was sweating a lot and then change him into some new clothes. The Grand Duke, on the other hand, doesn't protest. He simply asks in a low tone if she means she's going to do all that. Without hesitation she says yes, and after, reveals it's what she always does, but this time he simply tells her it's fine. She's confused, so he explains that he'd like to rest that day, asking her not to worry about him. He also tells her he'll begin eating from tomorrow. She says okay and reveals she'll just put some more firewood in the fireplace, asking him to have a good rest, but the Grand Duke suddenly asks if she's all right. He points out that her face looks completely pale, and asks if by chance she's feeling unwell. She's still stuck in a daze when he speaks again, asking her to have the servants take care of him from then on, making her wonder if he's maybe feeling shy, but then he drops a final request: don't do it yourself anymore. In a flash her resolve shatters, her hands tremble as she processes everything. This is the first time he had seen her face properly, so maybe he doesn't like the way she looks. She looked different from ordinary people, with a pale bloodless face, a thin body and white hair. The woman of House Hartborn looking that way was called a blessing in the early days of the Empire because they can produce a saint, but now it's just a symbol of short life. Even the maids from her family who have known her for a long time don't come near her because they say they don't want bad luck, so naturally, how would he feel when he's seeing her for the first time that day? She presses her lips together as the bitter realization settles inside her. She should have been more careful. She was so used to living with people who treated her normally. Outside her thoughts, she forces a distant response. She understands, she'll leave it to the servants from then on. She doesn't end there and follows with an apology, apologizing if the situation was unpleasant to him, but he responds almost immediately asking what she means. He insisted he hadn't said anything about feeling unpleasant. He pushes the blanket aside and tries to get up. He walks to her, carefully bringing up how he'd run out during the wedding and come back in a coma, and she was the one who took care of him for 3 years. Fighting the unsteadiness of his steps, he finally gets to her. He slams his hand against the wall beside her, his words sharp as he asks, "Am I not the one who made things more unpleasant for you?" She stares back at him in silence, unsure of what to think while he leans over. She suddenly breaks the silence with a loud yell, insisting he didn't. All he did was simply sleep peacefully. There was nothing unpleasant at all. She reveals she was the one who was clumsy a lot and made plenty of mistakes. She mentions that she'd even cut him sometimes while shaving. She apologizes to him for that, however he simply tells her he isn't angry about that, so she doesn't need to apologize. He glances back at her, his voice gentle as he admits he was only worried that life there might have been difficult for her. After all, she seemed very pale. She falls silent, her heart banging loudly against her chest as he wonders why he said that. Everyone already knew she was born that way, so then why would he suddenly mention that? An idea flashes in her mind and she immediately asks if he isn't aware that she has a huge defect. She tells him if he doesn't, that marriage could be considered a sham. Looking at his indifferent expression, she concludes that he really doesn't know and insists if he married her without knowing, then they have a huge problem. She fidgets as she explains how all the women born into her family have died before reaching adulthood, so she doesn't know when or how she'll die, but his voice suddenly cuts in with a firm, "I know." He tells her he's aware her name is Frida Claude Hartborn and that they are in a sham marriage. He asks her if she doesn't know what everyone usually says about him. She fails to respond, and as a result, thick silence stretches between them for a while until he lets out a loud sigh, breaking it. He walks back to his bed, agreeing to end the talking for that day, bringing up how he still needed rest. Without hesitation, she rushes to his side, holding the blanket for him while he lays down, but the flower patterns are disturbing to him. Unable to get used to the flower patterns, he asks if she can inform the servants to prepare another room for him, saying she could use that room if she liked. Sensing her hesitation, he asks if there is another problem and reveals there's only one bed in the castle that he can use. Recalling how Dominic had mentioned that they'd sold everything in the castle, he simply buried his head in his palm in frustration. He asks where she was sleeping that whole time, and she reveals that she'd slept next to him, with him, on the same bed. Despite the fact that he needed help, the Grand Duke summoned the Mullers the next morning. While she paced back and forth outside, thinking he was probably angry, after all she'd sold everything in the castle without telling him. Her mind drifts to how he wasn't happy about the marriage to begin with, and now, in addition to that, he knows what she did on impulse during his coma. She clutches her dress tightly, her heart racing as a thought claws at her sharply. What if he's so angry that he kicks me out? She knew she couldn't let that happen. Most of all, she didn't want to be separated from the people she grew close with, and she didn't want to give up her precious memories there. Rather, with the time she had left, she wanted to live as happily as she could. Suddenly Muriel appears, asking what she was doing outside, adding that Adele was looking for her. Frida doesn't respond to that, rather she asks if she happened to hear what the Grand Duke was discussing in his office, and Muriel answers saying no, after all the doors in the castle were so thick. She breaks down, suddenly calling out for Muriel. She mentions that the Grand Duke must be very angry, suggesting maybe she should have left some things in a few guest rooms, but Muriel doesn't hold back. She asks who would ever come so far out to their castle that they'll need a guest room. She tells her it's not like she bought jewelry or clothing with it, mentioning how she'd even gone as far as to give out her own personal belongings to the workers who cleared out the forest, while Frida simply insisting selling off everything in the castle without his permission was too much. Muriel cuts her off sharply, insisting that was only because he'd been laying around for years without earning a single coin. She immediately grabs her hand, insisting that wouldn't do it. She suggests she should at least get something to eat and then worry later. However, Frida simply tells her she doesn't have time for that. Annoyed, she picks her up from the ground into arms, ignoring her protests. Meanwhile, the Grand Duke stood in his office, watching from his window. A sigh escapes from his lips, and he crosses his arms as her words echo in his mind. If you married me without knowing this, then we have a big problem. Whether she dies sooner or later, it's still death, he thinks to himself. He reflects on how 3 years ago, he'd ran out of his wedding ceremony because he couldn't face that poor woman who had been thrust into his miserable life. Still, when he first saw her, all she did was cry like a baby. Later, Dominic and his father visit the Grand Duke's office. The marshal turns to his son with a smug look, asking if he hadn't told him the Duke would only need half a day to recover. However, his son cuts him off with a brutal reminder of how he was only just insulting him the previous day, saying he was weaker than his wife. Just as they are about to get into an argument, the Grand Duke interrupts with a furious slam at the table. Then his voice cuts through. Dominic Muller, Ricardo Muller, I can't believe you just stood by and watched while the situation got this bad. Now hand that over. Dominic stares back at his silence. Then he suddenly switches up, pointing at the herb in his hand. He asks if he's talking about the locally grown herbs. The Grand Duke, however, doesn't have time for his games. He warns him to stop playing dumb and clarifies that he was speaking about the key to the treasury that he had him hold for safekeeping. The steadiness in his voice falters as he asks just why he kept all that money and treasure a secret from her. Dominic, unable to avoid the situation, simply tells him he thought it was for the best. He insists he couldn't show it to just anyone. The Grand Duke then asks what would have happened if she had died before he woke up, noting that she would have suffered without even knowing they had all that money. Dominic, on the other hand, simply responds with indifference, saying that would have been unfortunate. A smirk escapes the Grand Duke's lips, his voice sharp as he admits that is the Dominic he remembers, a cold heart that doesn't waver in any situation. He isn't upset by this comment, rather he offers a simple bow, expressing his gratitude for such a compliment. The Grand Duke doesn't stop there, he insists now that he's awake he can tell her about it and asks him to hand over the treasury key. However, Dominic hesitates. Finally, he stretches the key to the Grand Duke with a trembling hand, but he suddenly pulls back, clasping the key in his hand as he admits if the Grand Duke was thinking of passing the key on to her he was against it. Noticing the Grand Duke's confusion, he quickly explains, bringing up how the Grand Duchess was an incredibly driven woman, so, if she gained access to that money, she'll definitely make that territory into the greatest land in the empire. The Grand Duke asks what is wrong with that, and he responds with a deeper question, asking if he believed the Empress Dowager would just stand by and watch that happen. He tells him he will be called back to the battlefield as the Emperor's hound again, and reveals he simply couldn't bear to see that happen again. His thoughts drift to how 3 years ago the Duke had suffered a head injury trying to save him. If the Duke had lost his life back then, he might have gone to the Empress Dowager and died after taking out all his anger on her for sending him into that deadly situation. There was only one reason he kept that rage bottled. Even though the Grand Duke was unconscious, he was still breathing, and he was able to get through all those days because he believed he would wake up one day. He drops to his knees, and pleads with the Duke to have faith in him, stating for now, he must remain as inconspicuous as possible. He asks if it isn't a better idea to give the Grand Duchess the key after things have settled down. After almost a minute of not getting a response, he opened his eyes to check the Duke's reaction, and after spotting him, relief washes over him. After all, he didn't look angry. But a question still lingered: did he persuade him? In a new scene, an urgent voice rings throughout the castle, insisting the Duke shouldn't overexert himself that way and he should return to his room and lie down. The Grand Duke, on the other hand, simply orders him to bring Balzac. The man hurrying behind him immediately panics, asking if he wasn't planning on writing right now. The doctor again insists he needs to rest. This time he explains that if he were to shock the muscles he hasn't used in a while, he might become paralyzed. Hearing that, a memory replays in the Duke's mind. The doctor's words reminded him of what happened a little while ago. A picture of Frida pops into his mind, and as he stands in silence he simply thinks, seriously, having a wife seems like nothing but a nuisance. A few hours ago, Frida had come to him holding a bucket and with a smile on her face as she announced that she'll massage his legs. She explains that he had said she needed to keep rubbing down on his muscles so they don't stiffen, after all she'd been doing it every day. The Duke's demeanor cracks, his eyes widening in embarrassment as he asks if she's been touching, no, massaging him every day. Beaming, she responds saying, yes, of course. She explains that sudden movements can put a strain on his body. After dipping the towel in a bucket of water, she squeezes out the excess water, but just as she reaches for his foot, he pulls back saying she's really fine so she doesn't have to do all of that. However, she pushes further, insisting she'll take care of him as usual, so he only needed to focus on getting better. But again the Duke stopped her, this time by grabbing her hand in the air just before she touches him. I'm a big hater of people in love, so... Taking advantage of her distraction, he gently slips the damp cloth out of her hand. Afterward, he asks if she doesn't feel uncomfortable being with him. As usual, she responds eagerly saying not at all. She adds that she is his wife and it's something she should naturally be doing, but the Duke's response completely drained her. For me, it's uncomfortable being with you. He'd only said that to get out of an annoying situation, but when she heard those words, her cheeks froze over. That look on her sad face had been stabbing his heart, and he hasn't been feeling good all morning. Now he pushes his hair backwards, admitting to himself in silence it was a constant uneasy feeling, like things are all tangled up. He thought his hair falling to his side was a nuisance, and at the same time understood solving it was simple. He turns to the doctor and asks him to bring him a pair of scissors. Either get rid of it, draw a line, or cut it off. In a new scene, she is seated in the dining hall having a meal with Muriel when the Grand Duke suddenly appears. Realizing she is in the middle of a meal, he suggests they talk later and asks Dominic to bring her to him when she's done. The minute he steps out, the maid behind her lets out a shocked gasp, wondering aloud how he can look so different just from cutting his hair, but Muriel remains unmoved. Noticing Frida's silence, she quickly asks if she's okay, and she responds saying it's fine, she was just a little bit surprised. Moments later, she follows behind Dominic, her mind unable to get over the Duke's sudden appearance and changed look. She ponders on how that was the first time she'd seen him like that since the wedding. She only saw him as a patient she had to take care of, but today, his striking appearance bore close similarity to that of an ancient god. Finally, they arrive at the Duke's office. Inside, he asks where she'd spent the previous night, mentioning how there wouldn't have been an extra bed for her, and she responds, almost immediately revealing she'd slept in Muriel's room. He suddenly gets up and stretches a hand towards her. He reveals he'd called her there because he had something to tell her, which included that issue, and he also had something to show her, asking her to follow him. He walks to a bookshelf, and with a soft tap, it unlocks, revealing a whole different space behind it. He picks up a candlestick and asks her to stay close to him since it's dark. She follows behind him patiently, still in disbelief over how that room had held a secret passage. Staring at the Duke, she wonders what he could possibly have to show her, thinking of how he walked so fast that it was hard to keep up. She ponders on how she's unable to fully stand in the sunlight, and she can't see well at night either. Naturally, since she's so close to death, dark places were even more frightening to her. She trembles behind him, beads of sweat forming on her face, until he suddenly turns around. Without uttering a single word, he shoved the candlestick into her hand and also lifted her from the ground, asking her to hold on tight. Flustered, she asks what he's doing all of a sudden, and he responds teasingly, saying it's because they'll get there by tomorrow, walking at that pace. With her in his arms, his steps grew even faster, while she on the other hand had her heating racing with so many questions. Like, just who that man was and how someone who has been lying in bed for 3 years is so strong. She thinks if her life is like a candle that can go out at any moment, this seems like as strong as a giant torch. Looking at him who's been in 3 years and still appeared way stronger than her, she couldn't help but feel a bit jealous. The Duke's sudden voice pulls her out of her thoughts. He drops her down and her eyes widen in shock the next minute. Faced with the amount of treasures in front of her, she can't help but exclaim loudly, "Wow." She immediately asks what that place is, and he tells her it is the estate's treasury. He asks for her hand and drops a key into her palm, asking her to feel free to make use of anything she'd like there. She beams with excitement and for more confirmation asks if everything in there is his, and he was giving her permission to use it, and he nods in agreement. However, he tells her it's under one condition. Confident, she asks what it is, claiming she'll do anything. To her surprise, he asks her to order a bed immediately. He insists it has to be without flower patterns, and she agrees immediately. In a new scene, the marshal suddenly asks the Duke what had made him change his mind. Ricardo responds lazily, asking what he's talking about, and clarifies that he was speaking about giving her the key to the treasury, saying he thought Dominic had talked him out of it. In response, the Duke admits he'd never talked him out of anything to begin with, and he was planning to give it to her from the start. He brings up how she'd been taking care of him for the past 3 years and asks what kind of man he takes him for, saying regardless of whether or not he is comfortable with her, that was a completely different matter. After all, she doesn't have much time to live anyway. He admits that's why he wants her to do whatever she wants while she's still alive. The marshal, however, mentions how the news that he's awake must have reached the ears of the Empress Dowager, and says if the Duchess was to make the treasury prosper even more, it could be a problem, insisting he'll be in danger. But he responds with a smirk, asking what she could possibly do with her frail body, telling him to not be ridiculous. However, the next second, Dominic bursts into the room angrily. He stomps angrily towards him, bringing up how he'd asked him not to give her the key, and asks what he's going to do now. The Duke asks what the problem is, but he just asks if he isn't aware of what she is doing at that moment. He grabs him by the collar, noting that if they were to leave things that way they'd be bankrupt in less than a year. His father hurries to caution him, asking what he was doing grabbing the Grand Duke by his collar like that, but he just asks what the big deal is now, mentioning how they used to play like that when they were younger. He lets go of the Duke's shirt and says he wasn't speaking from the place of someone serving him but as an old friend, saying it's not too late to stop her. The Duke asks why. He asks if she's going to buy a country with the money from the treasury or something, and Dominic responds claiming a country would at least have been useful if one bought it. Rather, she was planning on scattering the money on stupid roads. He explains that she said she was going to widen them and she wanted to build one that connected directly to the harbor. He questions aloud what the point is in making more roads on land that Leopold might take away at any moment. He reveals that was why he told her that such a large-scale project needed the Emperor's approval before it can begin, but her response was far from what he expected. He asks what kind of tremendous idea that is. He places a hand over his mouth, realizing he'd spilled out his true feelings, but he still insists he must stop her. He mentions how if word of that reaches the Empress Dowager, she'll drag him back to the battlefield, and the Duke responds saying he'll take care of it himself. Lastly, he storms out, leaving a final warning: if he wants him to work, he should stop his wife from causing trouble or find someone new to clean up after her. After saying that, he slams the door shut. The Grand Duke, on the other hand, simply ponders in silence. A road, huh? She's actually quite smart for a noble lady. In a new scene, Frida places some papers on the Duke's table. He asks what it is and she reveals that it is a report, explaining that she'd made a plan on how to build the roads and how to manage distribution. He brings up how he told her she didn't need to ask for permission for every little thing and asks her to just use it how she wishes. Also, he adds that it doesn't necessarily have to be for the land. For the first time since her arrival, he glances up from the document in his hand. Now that he's paying attention to it, she always dresses very plainly. He can't help but wonder who would ever look at her and think she's a Grand Duchess. He recalls how Dominic had mentioned that she sold all the jewelry she brought with her when she got married and gave the money to the workers. Looking at her, he thinks she should just live a luxurious life typical of a noble with the money he gave her. Just look at that face of hers, she looks like she's about to faint. He springs up suddenly, asking if she's unwell, and she responds saying not really. However, that doesn't stop him. He strides towards her and places a hand on her forehead, his voice gentle as he asks her not to lie to him. Facing him, standing so close to her, her heart begins to race faster. The Grand Duke suddenly flinches, pointing out that she has a fever. However, before she can reassure him, her body gives out and she collapses into his arms, the color drained from her face and her body shaking. Later, the Grand Duke settles beside her, while she lays in bed with a damp cloth on her forehead. Her eyes slowly flutter open and the Duke, noticing this, immediately asks if she's awake. She sits up, asking how long she's been asleep for, and he reveals it's been 2 hours. He urges her to get more rest since she still has a fever. However, she assures him it's fine, saying it was normal occurrence for and that day she was only just a little bit tired. Intertwining her fingers, she asks if he happened to see the report she's given him earlier. She explains that building a road required a lot of capital, so she was thinking about the Turk merchants who were visiting the castle the next day. The Grand Duke simply lets out a sigh. Just like before, he tells her she doesn't have to report every little thing to him. However, he suddenly mentions that starting from that day there is a condition she has to meet to enter the treasury. He asks if she wasn't in that state because she stayed up all night writing that report, and she immediately goes silent. So from then on, he tells her she wouldn't be allowed in the treasury when she's feeling unwell. While she's distracted by the sudden closeness, he gently reaches for her pocket. He dangles the key in front of her, informing her he'll be taking the key until her fever goes down. She protests, insisting it's ridiculous. She tells him she has a fever almost every day, so she'll never be able to get in the treasury, but he replies with an obvious smirk, remarking that it seems the treasury will be closed for a while. She hurries out of bed, asking how he can do that to her, insisting he can't just give something and take it back. In response, he tells her it's for her health and pleads with her to forgive his rudeness. He encourages her to have a good rest before stepping out, and she, still annoyed, throws a bucket at the door, calling him a liar. But the Grand Duke hadn't completely left. He raised a hand to cover his mouth while he laughed at how cute she was. On the other hand, Frida huffs angrily. Her mind immediately drifts to how the Turk merchants will arrive there soon, so that couldn't be happening. The Turk merchants have a rare bulb from a foreign land. The flowers that bloom from them are incredibly unique and beautiful. Selling them to the nobles will definitely bring a lot of money, and now Utrecht has the perfect climate for planting them. She had to buy and plant them now in order to harvest on time, and if a road was built connecting the castle to the port, she could sell even more flowers as well as the herbs she was already selling. She bites her bottom lips, finally resigning, "Fine. If he doesn't want to give it to me, I'll just steal it." There was only a day left until the Turk merchants arrived, and she had to steal the key from the Grand Duke before then. She clenches her fist, her resolve hardens as her mind echoes a stern reminder, she doesn't have much time left. She rummages through the Duke's belongings, recalling how she was told the Grand Duke usually goes out riding and doesn't return for a long time, and he wouldn't take any important items when he goes out far either. So that was her only chance to find the key to the treasury. Recalling the Duke's smug look, she thinks he wouldn't have imagined she would go so far as to check his room. A smile curves at the edge of her lips as she silently asks him to watch her open the treasury and make the deal with the Turk merchants, and show him what she's made of. However, even with the stool, she still struggles to reach the upper shelf. In the end, she grabs a random book to steady herself, however she doesn't expect the bookshelf to suddenly retract, revealing another secret passage just moments. She ends up falling forward into the passage, and like a blow to her wound, before she can pick herself back up, she hears a slow creak, accompanied by a sudden slam. Later that evening, the Grand Duke returns after writing. He raises a hand to wipe his sweat as he ponders on how writing seemed to be helping his body recover better. Also, he hadn't forgotten the way through the secret passage either. There were a total of 5 rooms connected to the secret passage inside Munheim Castle. As soon as he got up from bed, he checked to make sure he still remembered the paths correctly, and now, the only one left was in the Duchess's room. But just then he catches something. Looking at the room in front of him, he was getting a strange feeling from it. There were traces of someone breaking in. He glances around and notices the scattered books on the top shelf, confirming his suspicion. Then without hesitation, he reaches for his sword, certain it must be the Empress Dowager's spy. He steps closer, his sword unsheathed, laughing about the situation. From the look of things, the idiotic spy seemed to have gotten trapped in the secret passage while searching his room, the passage that couldn't be opened from the inside if one didn't know how. He pushes the door open, but the scene in front of him leaves him shocked. Frida, who collapsed on the floor, seemed unconscious. He crouches down immediately, wondering aloud just how long she's been there like that. He holds her in his arms, wondering what on earth had happened, when he recalls something. She was afraid of dark places. He remembered just how much she was shaking even when she was with him last time, but this time, she'd been there all alone. An image of her appears in his mind, her pounding on the door with all her strength, trying to call for her. He bursts out of the secret passage with her in his arms, asking if anyone is out there, and after spotting Dominic ahead, he urges him to call a doctor immediately. On the other hand, at Skandal Castle, a man offers a gentle bow, reporting how he'd received word that about 10 days ago, Grand Duke Richards woke up, "Your Majesties." The Empress Dowager remains calm, sipping gently on her tea before casually remarks that it appears he's quite the lively one, saying she thought he'd never wake up. Her son seated beside, however, calls her words a little harsh, especially when her son has been in a coma for the past 3 years. The Empress Dowager, glancing to the side, responds dismissively, asking how someone like that is his son, noting that commoner, Laura, is his mother. She doesn't stop there, she adds with a smirk that he was simply a dog who fetched whatever the Emperor tells him to, insisting that is all he's worth. At the same time, the Grand Duke stands anxiously beside the Grand Duchess. He hears the door creak open, and the next minute, Muriel rushes in with the doctor yelling, "My lady." She demands to know what on earth had happened. She clenches her fists, trying to suppress her rage, as turns to the Grand Duke yelling, "You." She delivers a punch to his face, still furious as she demands to know again what he'd done to her lady, calling him a piece of trash. The rather calm Grand Duke asks if she's lost her mind, and she shoots back, insisting he's the one who is crazy. She shifts his attention to her hair, her hands and clothes, and with barely suppressed rage she asks if he believes she doesn't know what happened. "You tried to force yourself on her, didn't you?" She continues, telling him if he needed a woman he should have taken a mistress, asking why he would do that to someone so weak, but the Grand Duke, who'd been holding back, simply lets out a sigh. Then his voice cuts through, cold and deadly. He tells her it appears she's misunderstanding something and warns that it's best she stops there. After all, he wasn't a very merciful person. He turns to her, his words even more clear as he adds, "Also, even if I had tried to take my wife, what would be the problem with that?" Perhaps he thought those words were enough to put her in her place, but it only made her livid, clenching her fist as repeats in anger, "What would be the problem, you ask?" The next minute she pulls out her sword, challenging him to a duel as Lady Frida's knight. She points her sword at him, her tone daring as she asks him to draw his sword. However, just as things are about to get heated, Dominic bursts in shock, asking if they were planning on having a duel. Muriel in response simply tells him that his lord had tried to force himself on her lady, and he turns to him without hesitation to scold him. He asks if he is crazy, pointing out how fragile she is, but the Grand Duke doesn't let him finish. He orders him to take Dame Muriel out of there immediately and follows with a low scowl, ordering all of them to get out. In a new scene, the Grand Duchess slowly regains consciousness. She takes a quick glance around, realizing she's in the Grand Duke's room. However, before she can process anything further, she hears him ask if she was looking for the key and jolts up in panic. She calls him with a shaky voice, but he simply repeats himself, asking if she was searching his bedroom for the key. She lowers her head, her tone dropping as she finally admits she was. In response, he steps slowly towards her, casually mentioning that he has so many enemies around him. He doesn't end there and tells her so even if he executed her on the spot because he thought she was a spy, it would be in his right, so if she feels like searching his room again in the future, she shouldn't. She apologizes again while he just stares at her in silence. Then less than a minute later, she feels something drop onto the blanket. He asks if she is going to trade with the Turk merchants who are coming to the castle, and she, beaming, confirms it and adds that she was supposed to pay them for the bulbs they are planting that fall. He appears confused and she explains that it is a flower that grows in the royal garden. If the bulbs were planted in the fall, they would bloom in the spring after the winter. In addition to that, they are supposed to look exactly like the turbans the merchants wear. She moves on to how the flowers usually come in different shapes and colors and are traded at very high prices where they're from. The rarer the color of the flower, the higher the price. She leans forward excitedly, claiming it'll only be a matter of time before the trend reaches virgin, and if they could cultivate the flowers in Utrecht, she could guarantee that their territory would flourish. When she finally goes silent, she realizes how awkward she'd made the situation, watching the Grand Duke stare back at her in silence. Until he unexpectedly breaks the silence and asks if she likes that place that much. She doesn't hesitate and responds with a smile, confirming that she indeed loves that place very much. For a brief moment, she felt like she could tell by the look on his face what he was thinking. The day when winter passes and the flowers bloom, and the territory prospers while the people are happy, might not be a day you live long to see, so why do you want it that badly? But disrupting her thoughts, the Grand Duke suddenly asks, what is there to like about such barren land? In response, tells him he might think her selfish for the words she's about to say, but regardless, she admits he actually liked that land was barren. Because of that, she had something to do and she could help the people too. She tells him she wants the people of Utrecht to live well even in the distant future. She mentions Muriel, Dominic, Ricardo. She suddenly goes silent, her thoughts drifting to the previous people there who had always treated her so kindly, including the one who helped her escape from her life of imprisonment. She mentions his children and their children too, and admits she wishes for them all to be safe. And for that reason she wishes to build a wall to protect everyone, and she planned to do so as long as she had the strength. In addition to that, she tells him she'll fulfill the duties entrusted to her, including the duties of the Grand Duchess, assuring him he doesn't have to worry. He feels a sharp sting, then he repeats, duties? She confirms it, stating she was referring to the duties of continuing the Richards family bloodline. She discloses that she thinks the Empress Dowager had chosen her because she believed she wouldn't be able to have children, but she'll do whatever she can to ensure he has an heir. His composure cracks. He hadn't expected those words from her, so he didn't exactly know how to react. He gathers himself quickly and responds, telling her she doesn't even know what that means, but she, with a firm nod, insists she understands and is also prepared for it. He goes silent. He could feel his restraint loosen, however, just as he reaches for her she delivers a painful blow. "So if there's a woman you have in mind, please tell me." He pulls back immediately, clenching his fist tightly. For further confirmation he asks if she's telling him to take a mistress so that he can have children, and she says yes. However, the next minute, he pushes her onto the bed, pinning her in place as he asks what'll happen if he says no. He tells her he has no intention of taking a mistress, revealing he was so sick and tired of hearing people being labeled as bastard children. She apologizes immediately, saying she didn't mean to insult him, but instead he cuts her off with a vague question, asking just how far she would go. "I think you should be the one to beat my child, so how far are you willing to go to help me?" He extends his hand slowly, reaching for her face. Then with his thumb pressing down on her lips he asks, "This far?" His eyes are unreadable, his voice like ice as he follows with an "or," while tracing the area of her chest where her cloth had torn. "How about this?" He leans in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, "And tonight, can I expect you to fulfill your wifely duties?" Her heart pounds faster against her chest and she nods, forcing down a gulp just before she speaks. She says she understands what he wants, but she isn't feeling well that day and asks if he can give her some more time. He falls silent for a while before responding with a simple, "Very well." The day of her meeting with the merchants from Turk finally arrives. After confirming the authenticity of her gold, their laughter ripples through the room while Muriel stands just outside the door. Looking at her, she forces a smile, wondering if her lady is happy because she'd gotten the deal she wanted while she's having a terrible time with everything that happened. A little while ago, she discussed with the Grand Duchess about what had happened and she'd exclaimed in shock over her conclusion. Afterward, she hurried to explain everything about the reason her clothes were torn. It turned out that the Grand Duchess had fainted while searching the Grand Duke's room for the vault key, and because he wanted his wife to save face, he didn't make any excuses and took the punch from her. She tries to pull herself together, but she can't stop the thought that she'd rather he lunge her back and they call it even. Later, she stands outside staring into the distance, asking Dominic if he's sure there's a harbor there. He responds nervously, asking if she must really build a road through that forest to be satisfied, but she simply tells him they need a road so they can easily sell goods from Utrecht, bringing up how hard it's been getting them in and out until now. She raises a finger and notes that it isn't merely a choice but a necessity, and he gives in. The next minute he points into the distance and recommends building the road in that direction, stating it is all part of Atlas Mountain, so even if she cuts down some of it, no one would complain. He turns to the other area and explains that it borders Weimar, so it could lead to conflict, and suggests they go with the safer option, seeing how the distance to the harbor was similar for both. Muriel asks how he knows that much, and he responds telling her it's because there aren't many people at Munheim Castle who can read and write. He complains that he's always being called even though he doesn't have any official title or position, he was just a mere mercenary, and asks why he has to deal with that kind of thing too. On the other hand, Frida, who'd been lost in thought the entire time, suddenly speaks. She tells them she's made her decision and asks that they build the road towards Weimar. Dominic, confused, asks if she didn't dislike conflict, and she responds claiming that's exactly why they need to build the road in that direction. She explains that if they were to only build one to the port for Utrecht, Weimar would lose out because they've already monopolized trade in that region, then they'll definitely try to stop them or slow them down. However, if they were to build a road towards them, they might see it as potentially profitable and would be able to trade with her, and the more roads the better. So in the long run, building the road towards Weimar is more beneficial. Suddenly they hear the steps of a horse approaching in the distance. Muriel pulls her to her side protectively while Dominic informs them someone is coming. Finally, a knight appears in front of her holding the Svergian imperial family's emblem. They both exchange a nod, understanding what that sudden move from the imperial family meant. They'd found out the Grand Duke had woken up. Meanwhile, the Grand Duke tosses a paper onto the table with a dry remark, the imperial family is really sending a spy. He picks up another document and read the contents. In recognition of the hard work the Grand Duchess had gone through, I am sending you a capable person as a steward to offer a small amount of assistance. Please do not refuse the sincere concern of a younger brother who worries for his elder brother and sister-in-law. Dominic doesn't hesitate and retorts with a scoff that if they'd known all along they should have sent someone soon, asking why they'd do that now, saying they were basically saying they want eyes on them. He asks who the rat they're sending is this time, and the Grand Duke reveals it is Baron Stefan Boyle. This time Muriel speaks. She tells him with certainty that the Baron is definitely from the Empress's dowager's side, disclosing that he used to tutor the Empress's nephew. She explains afterward that the reason she's able to remember him so well is because he was a college classmate of her older brother. Hearing that, Frida comments that he's smart, and Dominic responds claiming with that good head of his, he'll report everything to the Empress Dowager. However, she counters that, telling him he'd gotten it all wrong. Thanks to her caution, he ponders on it one more time, and after realizing how much benefit he gains, he rushes to the Grand Duke with a change of heart, insisting he tells him to come no matter what. He tells him he wasn't a rat but a blessing. However, the Grand Duke simply tells him whether he is a rat or a blessing, he's someone the Emperor is sending, so they'll have to keep him around for a while. He tells Frida he'll leave him in her hands, and she assures him not to worry, saying she'll give him so much work he wouldn't even have the time to consider sending secret letters. Even after she's finished speaking, the Grand Duke's gaze lingers on her, so much so that she notices and stares back awkwardly, wondering why he's suddenly looking at her. He clears his throat and tells them that's all for that day, permitting them to take their leave, but he suddenly calls Dame Muriel Roswald. "You stay." His chilling command made her freeze on the spot, and Frida could only glance back in concern, hoping she'll be all right. However, her concern vanishes the next second when she suddenly feels a sharp pain in her abdomen. In a new scene, at Skandal Castle, the Baron sits on a chair quivering. The Empress's sudden call causes him to snap his head up in an instant as she notes that he doesn't have to be so stiff. After all, she wasn't asking much of him. She offers an explanation, saying what she'd meant was that he didn't need to be so nervous about going to Utrecht, as she wouldn't be asking him to do anything difficult. Rather, all she wished to know was if the Grand Duke Richards had a woman. That's all. She switches the topic and mentions that she's sure he's aware why there are many civil wars in the Svergian Empire. Volstark, the first who succeeded the first emperor, had 12 children. He bestowed castles and titles on all of them, creating the 12 dukes. He then proclaimed that the next emperor, regardless of birth order, will be the most outstanding son out of the 12. Because of those words, their great empire began to fragment, and for 10 years after his death 4 families held the imperial throne, and they began embroiled in power struggles. Then one after the other they were wiped out in the struggle for the throne, until only her Weekser family and 4 others, including the Richards family, remained. She turns around, plastering a wounded expression on her face as she tells him that Dad, history mustn't be repeated, and she only wished to protect the current emperor's bloodline and set the Svergian Empire right. But her last words are like blades. That's why there mustn't be a woman trying to continue the lineage of a half-blood. On the other hand, Dame Muriel stood in the front of the Grand Duke, anxiously eating at her slowly. Under the intense pressure, heads of sweat trickled slowly down her cheek while she tried to understand what he was planning. If he was going to scold her, she'd rather he did it quickly rather than just stare at her like that. Just as she wished, the Grand Duke finally breaks the silence with a question, asking if the sword she had with her was called Colder. She responds immediately, saying yes, and adds that it's her family's sword. The Grand Duke, however, simply calls it a waste of a sword for a knight who'd been reduced to a nanny, asking how someone like her ended up becoming a knight for the Harkborn. She responds saying the Count had given her great help once and she wanted to repay his kindness, however he didn't want anything from her except for her to guide the one daughter he had left. He responds with a simple, "Is that so?" before falling silent again. The next minute he calls her and asks if she wished to follow through with her challenge for a duel. She lowers her head, offering an apology for what had happened before, and agreed to collect any punishment. However, he simply responds saying she served his wife and not him, so punishing her wasn't his duty. However, challenging him to a duel was a different story. He accepts her challenge for a duel in the form of a spar, and to make it more competitive agrees to grant her any wish if she defeats him. But if he was to win, she'll grant him colder. She asks if he's being serious, and he nods in response. She falls silent, pondering on the deal, a wish. She clenches her fist as if tightening her resolve before giving him her response, I accept. The Duke is to be held in 2 days, during the day, and will be held on the training grounds in Mannheim Castle. The Grand Duke trains intensely in his room while Frida rushes to him after only just hearing about his duel with Muriel. She worries about him getting hurt in the process in addition to his current condition, and gets even upset when she thinks of how Dominic was even trying to stop him. She arrives at his door and asks if she may come in, and he says yes. However, the minute she steps in, a loud gasp escapes her mouth in shock. The sight in front of her was really distracting, but regardless she forces herself to speak and asks why he isn't wearing any shirt. He responds shamelessly, asking if she's that surprised, saying he thought she knew his body since she's been tending to him for the past 3 years, but she only argued that the situations were different, then he was unconscious. Unable to stop herself, she peeks at him through the space in her fingers. Looking at him, she realizes she'd never noticed it before, but her husband was really big. She gathers herself and asks if it was really true he was having a duel with Muriel the next day. He confirms that it is indeed true, and she immediately asks why he would do that. She pleads with him not to go through with it, bringing up how he hadn't fully recovered yet, and says it would be a big problem if he was injured. The Grand Duke responds, pointing out how she seemed to think he'd lose to her, but she just falls silent. She ponders on how Muriel was the strongest knight in the north and had made a name for herself throughout the empire, while the Duke hadn't held a blade in 3 years, so there was no way he'd be able to defeat her. The Grand Duke steps closer, telling her she doesn't have to worry about him, rather she should worry about her own health. Last time you said you couldn't fulfill your duties because you weren't feeling well. From what I see today, you look very healthy. So is it possible today? Your duty as a wife, I mean. She steps back, her voice faltering as she responds, saying she thinks he'll have to wait a few more days. He asks her what the reason is this time, and she hesitates before saying, it's just that, my period hasn't ended yet. That's all for now. Thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe and comment down your thoughts on this video.